Hi, everyone. Thank you all for joining us this evening. It is my pleasure to welcome you to our program titled Another Promised Land, a Texan Perspective on Southern Jewish History with Dr. Joshua Furman. I am Matthew Silverman, the director of the Haberman Institute, and I'm very excited about this lecture. My wife is actually a native Houstonian, and we lived there before moving to the Washington, D.C. area in 2019. I also had the opportunity to build a friendship with Dr. Furman. Reflecting back to that time, there were a number of floods in Houston, culminating in Hurricane Harvey in 2017, which devastated the city and much of the Jewish community. One of the outcomes of the damage caused by the flooding was the need to preserve our Jewish history. And so the Houston Jewish History Archive at Rice University was created, of which Dr. Furman is the founder and curator. I look forward to learning about the artifacts collected and the core themes of Southern Jewish history as told from a Texas perspective. Before I conclude, I would like to thank the many organizations that helped bring this event to the community, including the Jewish Federation of Greater Washington, Northern Virginia congregations, Adat Raim, Agudas Hachim, Eitz Chaim, Sha'arei Shalom, Temple Beth Shalom, the Gesher Jewish Day School, and the Poses JCC. And now I would like to welcome Rachel Eiches, a Haberman Institute board member, to introduce our speaker. Hi, Rachel.
Hi. Thank you, Matt. Welcome to everyone joining us today from our local community in the DC metro area, and to many more joining from across North America. Welcome, Texas, and everyone beyond. We are looking forward to our program tonight, Another Promised Land, Texas, Perspectives on Southern Jewish History with Dr. Joshua Furman. This should be a fascinating and timely exploration. I am Rachel Eiches, a board member of the Haberman Institute for Jewish Studies. The vision of the Haberman Institute is a Jewish community enriched through quality, lifelong Jewish learning. Our next program will be on February 22nd, our much anticipated lecture with Dr. Benjamin Sumner. Did the Exodus happen? History, Memory, and Theology. You can learn more about this program and many others on our website, habermaninstitute.org. And on to tonight's program. Full disclosure, my only connection with Texas is my nephew David and his family in Dallas, where the kids are being raised Jewish. Dr. Joshua Furman, tonight's speaker, is a native of San Antonio. The founder and curator of the Houston Jewish History Archive at Rice University, he also serves as the associate director and lecturer in the program in Jewish Studies. At Rice, Dr. Furman offers courses on immigration history, American Judaism, Black Jewish relations, and Jewish food. His most recent publication is a chapter about Jewish Houston in the book Making Houston Modern, The Life and Architecture of Howard Barnstone, which was published in 2020 by the University of Texas Press. He also authored an essay on migration in American Jewish history for the volume Interpreting American Jewish History at Museums and Historic Sites, published in 2016 by Roman and Littlefield. His article about Jewish immigration into Texas by way of the Galveston movement will appear in the 2022 issue of the Southern Jewish History Journal. Currently, Dr. Furman is working on a book project about the history of Houston's Jewish community from the 1800s to the present. Dr. Furman received his PhD in modern Jewish history from the University of Maryland in 2015. After his talk, we will open the floor to your questions, which we will accept by way of the Q&A function on Zoom. We will not be able to take any questions live tonight. And with that, The Zoom box is yours. Dr. Furman, thank you for sharing your expertise and your insight with us this evening.
Well, good evening, everybody. Howdy. Thank you for that very generous introduction. This is a special night for me. I wish I were back in Maryland with you all in person. Hopefully we'll be able to do that another time. This is very special. I, as you heard, received my PhD from the University of Maryland and lived in the Maryland area for 8 years. And I actually got to know Rabbi Haberman personally. He was a very, very special person. And I know there's many friends and family watching this evening. It's a joy to be with you. So I'm going to share my screen with you now. And the idea is that I'm going to speak for the better part of an hour I'm going to read those questions and relay them to me later. So before we get into the Texan perspective on Southern Jewish history, really on American Jewish history, I wanted to take the liberty tonight to just share a little bit about my work creating and developing the Houston Jewish History Archive here at Rice University. And the story of the archive really begins with Hurricane Harvey, which is an event that I know Matthew remembers all too well. And those of you watching who live in the Houston area will remember all too well. Hurricane Harvey in late August of 2017 dumped more than 50 inches of rain on the city in the matter of 3 days. And you can see here, this is an intersection in Southwest Houston near our JCC. And the top picture is what it should look like. And the bottom picture is what it looked like during Hurricane Harvey. And to make a very long story short, in the aftermath of the storm, I was part of an effort of Rice University professionals, community volunteers, and Rice students to try to collect and preserve as much historical records from the city's Jewish institutions as we could. This is a snapshot of Congregation Beth Yeshurun here in Houston, which is actually the largest conservative congregation in the United States and second largest in all of North America. And you can see here some of the damage that was done to the congregation's historical records. This is unfortunately what floodwaters can do to photographs. It's irreversible damage. Luckily, however, in our efforts, we were able to save the vast majority of the congregation's archives, which are now part of the Houston Jewish History Archive at Rice. So what we do is we collect, preserve, and make accessible the documents, photographs, artifacts, and memories that tell the story of Jewish life, primarily in Greater Houston, but increasingly across the entire South Texas region. We collect a broad array of materials. The things that we collect have to relate to Jewish life in Texas, but this includes, as you can see, scrapbooks, family photographs, diaries, mementos from Jewish life cycle events, institutional records, Jewish military veteran records, artifacts, and even audio and video recordings as well. We also have been moving into the work of conducting oral histories, interviewing Jewish Texans about their experiences, when their families came to Texas, how they went about the business of making a life here, negotiating between being Jewish and being Texan, a theme that we're going to return to quite a bit this evening. We sponsor exhibits, lectures, and public programs, and we have a website and a vibrant social media presence as well. This is a link to our homepage, and I invite you to take a look at it either during tonight's program or afterwards, and I can share that link in the chat window a little bit later on with you as well. All right, so that's a little bit about how I got into the work of doing Texas Jewish history. However, at the same time, I am a Jewish Texan. I was born in Dallas. I grew up in San Antonio, and now I live and work in Houston. But this is not necessarily the career that I envisioned for myself. It's something I sort of fell into because of Hurricane Harvey and the need to do something. I can talk more about my career path, I suppose, when we get to the Q&A time. So I want to share two really interesting sources with you that I imagine you probably haven't seen before. The first is an editorial that appeared in the Houston Daily Post. You can see it's from August 4th, 1908, and it reads as follows. With no desire to butt in ahead of other states, which are anxious for an industrious and law-abiding population, we should like to call attention to the fact that Texas has room within her borders for all the Israelites in the world, and then some. Those who are interested in the scheme for Jewish colonization would do well to bear that fact in mind. So this is a really interesting and probably surprising comment for a Texas newspaper to be making in 1908, right? But it encapsulates one of the themes that I'm going to be discussing with you all this evening, and that is this idea of Texas as a kind of alternative promised land for Jews. What opportunities has Texas provided for Jews, and what struggles and difficulties have they also had to overcome? More on that in just a second. But this idea that Texas is a land of opportunity is a concept that we're going to be exploring in more detail momentarily. And then you have this other source. This is a letter that was received by Isaac Leeser. You may be familiar with Leeser. He was one of the foremost American Jewish leaders of the mid-19th century. He was the first to translate the Hebrew Bible into English in the United States. He was the editor of one of the leading Jewish newspapers of his day, the Occident. He was based in Philadelphia. And here he gets a letter from an Isaac Jelonic, who was living at the time in Belton, Texas. And you're saying to yourself, where is Belton, Texas? I have located it for you on this map. It is between Austin and Waco, to the extent that that is helpful for you in your knowledge of Texas geography. There is, by the way, a Starbucks in Belton, Texas. The first question I always ask is there a Starbucks there? There is, in fact, a Starbucks in Belton, Texas. And Jelonic writes, I'm not going to read the whole letter out loud. You can see it on your screen and you can read along with me. Jelonic writes to Leeser to acquire a subscription to the Occident, to acquire Leeser's translation of the Hebrew Bible and his prayer book. And he says, it will surprise you to hear from such a remote part on the frontier of Texas. And yet, Jelonic says, right, I am fulfilling the prophecy that the Jews should spread out across the world to bring the divine message of the chosen people to the other nations of the world. So this gives us a little bit of a different view on Texas as a Jewish homeland, right? From this letter, the impression we get is that Texas is something of a cultural wasteland, right? It's not a land of great Jewish learning, of synagogues, of schools, et cetera, et cetera. So how do we deal with those sort of competing ideas about Jewish life in Texas? Number one, Texas is a land of opportunity for Jews, but then also Texas is a kind of Jewish backwater, right? Which is a reputation that I think Texas and probably the rest of the American South have held on to for far too long. So what I want to do tonight is move past those ideas a little bit and take a wider view and think with you about how the Texas Jewish experience can offer us a window onto some broader patterns in both Southern Jewish history, but also American Jewish history as well. So yeah, here are our questions. How does Texas Jewish history illuminate important themes in not only the Southern Jewish experience, but the American Jewish history narrative more broadly? And then finally, we're going to ask tonight, what's special about Texas? Is Texas different or distinctive in any kind of meaningful way as a site of Jewish history and Jewish life? Maybe it is, and maybe it's not. You'll decide for yourselves. Bear with me, folks. I'm just going to pop out of full screen for a second, just to check what's happening in the chat window. Please do remember, as questions occur to you, to send them to me in the Q&A. All right, here we go. Now I have to actually close the chat window, which I don't seem to be able to do. Sorry, guys. My Zoom is frozen. Okay. So just a little bit about, hang on, you can't see my screen. Okay, I think I fixed it. Quick history of Texas Jewry on one foot. So one question we want to ask is, when does Texas Jewish history begin? And there's sort of two competing arguments to be made here. The first goes all the way back, as you can see, to the 1500s and to a man named Luis de Carvajal, who is born in Portugal to a converso family, to a family that had converted to Christianity under duress in the era of the Inquisition. And he's made the governor of the Spanish province of Nuevo León, a region in the New World that included present-day Texas. And he's convicted, ultimately, of shielding his sister and her relatives from the Inquisition. They were caught and accused of Judaizing, of practicing Judaism in secret, even though officially they had converted to Catholicism. Carvajal died in prison. His sister and his nieces and nephews all were burned at the stake in Mexico City. So this feels like an important moment, but it doesn't quite feel like a starting point for Texas Jewish history. They did not, because of the limitations placed on them by the Inquisition, they did not establish a Jewish community in the area that would become Texas. They did not live openly Jewish lives. It was not a possibility that was open to them. And so this seems to me like maybe not the best moment to begin Texas Jewish history with. But we find that Jews are present in Texas from the earliest period of Anglo settlement, going all the way back to the 1820s. There was a handful of Jews that participated in the Texas Revolution of 1835 and 1836. Among the most famous of these was Albert Moses Levy, who was Sam Houston's physician and surgeon-in-chief of the Texas Army, and who was actually wounded, as you can see, at the Siege of Bear in San Antonio in 1835. It takes until the 1850s for Jewish institutions to begin to establish themselves. And you can see here Congregation Beth Israel in Houston, which is the oldest Jewish house of worship in the Lone Star State. This was its first building. But already by the late 1850s, several Texas cities have active houses of worship. Just a quick note about one of the most early prominent Texas Jews, a man named Jacob de Cordoba, who was a Sephardic Jew, born in Jamaica, came to the United States, lived a little bit all over the place, and then came to Texas in 1839 and managed to achieve quite a lot in a very short period of time. You can see here he was a founding member of the Houston Chamber of Commerce. He was an extremely successful real estate businessman. He was a politician, both serving as a Houston alderman and then a representative in the Texas legislature. But that's not all that that Cordova managed to accomplish. He helped to lay out and establish the town of Waco in 1848. And in the field of cartography, he actually helped to create one of the first maps of Texas, shown here in 1849. So from an early stage, Jews, albeit in very small numbers, were able to come to Texas and make quite an impact. So what I want to do now is turn to some themes in Texas Jewish history, which I think are integral to the story of the Texas Jewish experience. But of course, we'll also have echoes not only across the southern United States, but across all of American Jewish history. And so perhaps, what we'll see is that Texas Jews are like all American Jews, except more so, right? That's a kind of fun saying. So here we're going to meet briefly a man named Louis Levy, who came to Houston relatively early on and publishes this editorial in the Asmonean, which is a New York Jewish newspaper with a national circulation. And it's basically a recruitment ad to encourage Jews to come to Texas. Now, why should they come to Texas? Levy writes as follows: in our own state, thousands of acres of land can be bought within the settled portions of the state for the small sum of from 25 cents to $1 per acre. Good, arable, fertile land where a man can make his living to his liking, and more independent than the autocrat of Russia or the emperor of Austria themselves. Indeed, Levy wrote, I would not exchange my 15-acre lot with the house on it and the garden around it, which I possess near the city of Houston, for all thrones and hereditary dominions of both those noted persons. For we will see if we live, who will have a shelter of their own 15 years from now. And he goes on to say, if only we could convince the oppressed Jews of Europe living under the thumb of despots, living under crushing poverty and crippling legislation, to come here and to come to Texas, we would have a real opportunity at providing Jews with a better life. Well, it took a long time for that idea, unfortunately, to catch on, but it is a concept, this idea that Texas is a Jewish promised land. It is an idea that would find a champion of sorts some years later in a project that became known as the Galveston movement. Now, some of you may have heard of this before. I've spoken on it elsewhere, and I have an article coming out later this year about the Galveston movement. In short, this was a project that took place in the years before World War I. You can see it ended in 1914. The idea of which was to bring Eastern European Jews to the United States, not through Ellis Island, but through the port at Galveston Island in Texas, and then from Galveston into the American heartland. And just under 10,000 Jews actually did this, came over to the United States through Galveston. About a third of that number or so, maybe closer to a quarter actually, 2,500, stayed in Texas, and the rest went to destinations in the Midwest and some other places in the South. Here at the Houston Jewish History Archive, we were very fortunate just a few years ago to acquire on the Rare Judaica book market this pamphlet. This is the original pamphlet that was printed in Kiev in 1907 to recruit Yiddish-speaking Eastern European Jews to come to Galveston, to take a chance on this project. And you can see here, those of you who read Yiddish will have a bit of a field day with the cover. This is what the inside of the brochure looks like. We've had it translated and digitized, as you can see, and later this year we'll be publishing the translation of this document. I want to share with you part of that translation tonight, which was done by my friend and local Yiddish expert, Maurice Wolfthal. So some facts about the state of Texas. This is from the Galveston pamphlet. The state of Texas is the largest of all the United States. It occupies some 260,000 English square miles, I'm rounding down, and is larger, for example, than all of France. Its soil is especially fertile for grazing cattle and cotton plants. Except for its southern section, i.e. Houston, its climate is good for your health, especially in the winter months. The population of the state consists of Englishmen, Spaniards, Germans, Frenchmen, Negroes, Indians, and others. There are Jews in significant numbers only in the larger cities, especially Houston, Dallas, San Antonio, and Galveston. The population of the state is approximately 3 million people. Compared to its huge area of territory, its population is very small. The state still has lots of empty space for new immigrants. So what's fascinating to me about this pamphlet, again, is the idea that Texas is a land of opportunity, right? It's almost depicted as a land flowing with milk and honey, right? For those of you familiar with that rhetoric that we associate more commonly with the Zionist movement, right? Fertile soil, open space, good climate. It's a land that's diverse, right? So Jews won't stick out as foreigners here. And there are significant Jewish communities in the larger cities, which is a theme that we're going to come back to also tonight. And interestingly, as a kind of final point before we move on here, the state still has lots of empty space for new immigrants, unlike, for example, the Lower East Side of New York. Part of the idea behind this project, and I don't have a whole lot of time to go into it now, but if you're interested in learning more about the Galveston movement during the Q&A segment of the program, we can certainly do that. But part of the motivation for this project was to get Jewish immigrants out of New York, really by never allowing them to set foot there in the first place, and selling them instead on the idea that Texas and other parts of the sort of middle America, as it were really where the better opportunities were for Jewish immigrants in the first decade of the 20th century. So I want to just briefly touch on another important point in Texas Jewish history, and that is related to this idea of economic opportunity. And that is to sort of spotlight the families, the Jewish immigrant families that came to Texas, and by virtue of hard work and dedication, established magnificent retail empires, especially in merchandise, in jewelry, in furniture, in clothing. Those of you who are Houston natives will of course remember Sakowitz. Neiman Marcus is probably the most famous name of all. The Zales jewelry empire had its start in Wichita Falls, Texas, and then here locally in Houston, we have Star Furniture, which is still going strong today, and then the Weingarten's grocery chain, which no longer exists, but for decades was one of the preeminent grocery store chains in Houston and across the South. So that was one way in which that idea of Texas as a land of opportunity really manifested itself. So now I want to move on to a bit of cultural history, the idea of Jews becoming Texans. And one of the most interesting ways I think we can do that is to look at how Jews adapted to the Texas food scene in different ways. As the introduction mentioned, I teach a Jewish food class here at Rice, which is always really fun to do. This is one of the oldest published Jewish cookbooks in Texas. It's from 1911, as you can see here. And one of the recipes of note in this book actually gives detailed instructions on how to cook and serve a possum dinner. And not as a joke, right? Not as a tongue-in-cheek thing, but actually as something that you might want to do. Other ways in which Jews adapted to the local food scene. This is a cookbook from the Galveston chapter of the National Council of Jewish Women. And as you can see, it's from December of 1950. And it's a recipe for guacamole. And so you might say to yourself, well, what's interesting or noteworthy about a recipe for guacamole? Well, there's a number of things that I find fascinating about this recipe. First of all, you have to love the dancing avocados wearing sombreros. I never get tired of that. But note that the instructions for the recipe have to explain what guacamole is. It's 1950. Guacamole has not yet crossed over and become the ubiquitous, Tex-Mex American condiment that it is today. So the recipe not only has to explain how to make guacamole, but it has to explain what it is and what to do with it. And you can see here the instructions say use it as a cocktail spread using Fritos to dip in. I love that detail too, right? Not potato chips, but specifically Fritos. And you can also, garnish it with chopped tomato and put it on a lettuce leaf to enjoy it as a salad. So how did Texas Jews learn to be Texan? One of the ways that they negotiated that dual identity was in trying new foods, in trying new recipes. Now, sometimes, as in the case of the possum dinner, right, that entailed making significant compromises with the Jewish dietary laws, but not always. And today, it's been hampered a little bit because of COVID, but there is a vibrant kosher chili cook-off scene, first in Dallas and more recently in Houston, in which, at least in Houston, the entire community participates. Synagogues and Jewish organizations will send delegations with, pots of chili. And because it's kosher, everybody can participate and enjoy. So it's kind of yet another way in which this synthesis between Judaism and Jewish culture and Texan culture seems to be flourishing and thriving into the 21st century. I want to talk just briefly about another important theme in Texas Jewish history, and that has to do with political leadership. In Texas and across the South, Jews have served in many levels of political leadership. Galveston has had 5 Jewish mayors, for example, and it was also served by A.R. Babe Schwartz in the state legislature for decades. And Annette Strauss, as you can see here, was mayor of Dallas at the end of the 1980s and beginning of the 1990s. We all almost had a Jewish governor. You were probably waiting for Kinky Friedman to make an appearance tonight. And here he is. This is a souvenir Kinky for Governor poster that we have in the collections of the Houston Jewish History Archive, along with an autographed note that was donated to us. And so, it's interesting and important to track the ways in which Jews have managed in Texas and in the South to find positions of political influence, as we saw going all the way back to the time of Jacob de Cordoba in the 1850s. So we'll talk now about a really important theme in Texas Jewish history, and really, life in the Bible Belt as well, and that is the primacy of interfaith relations. Living as more of a pronounced minority in Texas and in the South than in New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, right? The need to develop strong interfaith relations here has always been an important subject, and that goes back to, as you can see here, this World War II era observance of Brotherhood Week, which was a national interfaith initiative that lasted for decades, not only in Texas, but across the country. And then you have the phenomenon of the Texas rabbi as the emissary or the representative of the Jewish community to the wider Christian community. And there's many examples of rabbis in Texas who filled that role, including Rabbi Israel Rosenberg of Wharton, Texas, shown here. And then probably the most famous example of this, probably the most famous rabbi in Texas history without much debate, Rabbi Henry Cohen of Galveston. Rabbi Cohen of Galveston is famous for a number of things. He was an integral participant in the Galveston movement. It was one of the reasons Galveston was chosen as the immigration port for that project, was because of the presence of Henry Cohen on the island. And there's a famous quote attributed to Henry Cohen. It may be apocryphal, but it's sort of printed and reprinted everywhere. And it's very catchy, and it goes like this. He said, "To me, there is no such thing as Episcopalian scarlet fever, Catholic diabetes, or Jewish mumps." And this from a man who was extremely dedicated to interfaith relations, who enjoyed a decades-long friendship with Father Kerwin in Galveston, and who really leveraged his interfaith friendships and partnerships to fight back against the Ku Klux Klan during its rise to prominence in the 1920s, which is a fascinating subject of its own. So that is a good segue, I think, for the next topic that I want to discuss with you all this evening, and that has to do with race and racism and the place of Jews in the racial dynamics of Texas and the South. And I believe you may have had another lecture on this topic, or maybe you will have later this year another lecture program on Black-Jewish relations or race relations in the South. Everybody knows Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, right, who famously marched in Selma with Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. But less well known is this man, Rabbi Moshe Kahana, who came from Houston's Congregation Bris Shalom, and you can see him here participating in the march in Selma. And he had a very poignant explanation that he gave, Rabbi Kahana did, to the Houston Chronicle in March of 1965 as to what compelled him to go to Selma to participate in this march for Black voting rights. And he talked about an anecdote from the era of the Nazis, and he talked about the Nazis taking Jewish prisoners on a death march through towns, and that the townspeople turned their backs and pretended not to know what was happening. And that was the reason for so much additional Jewish suffering. And so Rabbi Kahana wrote in 1965 and said, right, I am not going to stand by while so much suffering is going on. So he very eloquently connected the impulse, the need, the urgency for Jews to take a stand on Black civil rights to the experience of the Holocaust. And this is not the only important figure, the only inspiring figure in terms of Texas rabbis taking a stand on this issue. So Rabbi Ephraim Frisch of my hometown of San Antonio, from its Reform Congregation Temple Beth El, In 1930, when it was really not politically expedient or judicious for him to do so, gave this sermon speaking out against a lynching, a really awful lynching incident which had just taken place in Sherman, Texas, and wrote to say that, clearly, right, the Bible, which is revered alike by Christian and Jew, says, "Thou shalt not kill." That's one of the 10 Commandments. We have the 10 Commandments hanging in our sanctuary. He wrote, "If we really mean to take our religion to heart, then in addition to the considerations of law and order, of humanity and of civic pride, we must bestir ourselves to uproot this terrible sin from our midst as an offense to God and a degradation of our divine nature." So again, that was a very bold position for Rabbi Frisch to take in Texas in 1930, and yet nevertheless, he did so. And I think it's important to recognize and to elevate these voices and these opinions. When we talk about Jewish participation in the civil rights movement, we tend to only focus on Rabbi Heschel. And this is not to minimize Rabbi Heschel's impact and his contributions, but to say that Rabbi Heschel was not a lone voice in the wilderness. And there's a longer history of Jewish activism on behalf of Black civil rights. At the same time, however, the picture is not always so positive or so clear cut. And we can also talk about white flight in Houston and in other Texas and southern cities. There was a neighborhood here in Houston, again, because of time considerations, I can't talk about it at length. But in the 1950s, the Riverside Terrace neighborhood of Houston, which had been a majority white and Jewish neighborhood, in a matter of a few years, as African Americans began to move in, Jews and other whites moved out and relocated to other parts of the city. Why they did so is a complicated story, but it's one that has a deep and lasting legacy on the history of my city. There was an effort by some residents to try to preserve and maintain an integrated neighborhood, and there's a wonderful film on this topic by the name of this poster. "This is our home, it is not for sale." It's hard to find a copy of it, but I can try to help you locate it if you're interested in issues around the history of neighborhoods that transition from being Jewish neighborhoods to Black neighborhoods. It's a really important, critical topic in not just Texas history, but really American history as well. And then, of course, the sit-in protests that began in Houston in 1960 often targeted lunch counters in Jewish-owned businesses, such as the one shown here. So there's a complicated history here around Texas Jews and Southern Jews and race, and it's one that sort of has positive and also negative aspects to it. And it's important, I think, to study both together. As I kind of begin to wind down my prepared remarks, and I look forward to your questions, the last dynamic that I want to examine with you, which is a ever unfolding one in many ways, is almost a kind of tale of two phenomena. And that is, on the one hand, the decline of small town Jewish life in Texas, and at the same time, dramatic growth in urban communities. And you can see here one of these small town communities. This is Congregation B'nai Israel in Victoria, Texas, about 2 hours west, of Houston. And like so many small town Jewish communities, it is really facing difficult times in the last few years. Another example of this, and here you can see in the collections of the Houston Jewish History Archive, the Constitution of B'nai Israel of Victoria, Texas from 1895. Pretty neat. And then you have the case of congregations that have completely disappeared, such as this one. This is Congregation Shereth Israel in Wharton, Texas. Wharton, Texas is about, I think, 60 miles or so from Houston, if I'm remembering correctly. And for most of a century, it had a small but vibrant synagogue that was a kind of hub for all the small towns in that region, of which there were several that had one or two or a handful of Jewish families. But already by the early 2000s, there were not enough Jews left in the area to sustain the congregation, and so it had to close its doors. And the congregation folded, and a few years later, the congregation sanctuary building sadly burned down, and so it's completely gone. All that survives of Shereth Israel are the archival records and the memories of the people who grew up there, both of which we work very hard to collect. You can see some of those archival materials here, including a dedication from its a new building in 1956 and some issues of the Shereth Israel newsletter. So the picture today is very interesting. I actually have little faith in these numbers that you're looking at. I think that they're all probably wrong. They're all probably too small. But as of a few years ago, Dallas claimed 75,000 Jews, Houston just over 50,000, 25,000 in Austin, and 10,000 in San Antonio. But even as small town Texas Jewish communities are dwindling, the larger cities are booming, fueled primarily by an exodus of Jews from the Northeast, the Midwest, and the West Coast to places like Texas, especially Dallas and Houston, which have several kosher restaurants, multiple Jewish day school options, and a relatively affordable cost of living. So having spent the last better part of an hour learning about the Texas Jewish experience, we're sort of left with this question, right? What's distinctive or different about Texas Jews as opposed to Jews in the greater Washington area, for example, or New York, or Florida, or California? And I want to propose four things which aren't necessarily only unique to Texas, but that in aggregate, I think separate Texas from most other places that we could think about in comparison. And the first is one that I haven't really spoken about yet tonight, but that's really important. And that is the presence of a vital subgroup of Spanish-speaking Jews in Texas Jewish communities today, Jews from Mexico, from Latin America, and other destinations, especially in San Antonio, where I'm from, especially in the communities in the Rio Grande Valley. The idea that you go to synagogue on Shabbat and you hear, Spanish being spoken, not at all unusual or strange if you live in these parts. And Texas Jewry is really diverse, and not only in this way as well. You may already know this, but you may not. There was a very significant migration of Jews from South Africa to Texas beginning in the 1970s and 1980s. In particular, in Houston, they were South African Jewish doctors were drawn here by the medical center, which is actively recruiting them. Obviously, having similar weather to South Africa was a draw for Texas. But Texas is also home to a large community of Israelis, of Jews from the former Soviet Union, and so the diversity within the Texas Jewish community, even though it's not that large, probably really kind of out of proportion to its size, I would argue, which is really interesting. Two more points that I want to make before I turn things over to Matthew and to the question and answer portion. Number one, this idea that promised land ideology has, I think, remained central to Texas Jewish identity. And one of the first things that I noticed when I moved back to Texas, after having lived in the DC area and lived in New York and Boston for a period of time, is that here in Texas, Zionism seems to remain central to Jewish identity in a way that I just don't think is true in other parts of the country. And I see it as a trans-denominational phenomenon, which I think is worth exploring, the centrality of Zionism and of identification with Israel to Texas Jewish identity. And then finally, we have something that I call the Texas mystique, this idea that, Texas is a whole other country. Obviously, at one point in its history, it was an independent republic, that no place on earth is like the Lone Star State. And so to live here, to be Texan, is to be part of a unique and special place, right? As the saying goes, not from Texas, but I got here as soon as I could. So hopefully this program has sort of introduced you to Texas Jewish history on foot, some of the critical issues and themes. And I'm interested now to engage with you in some question and answer, and to see what it is you'd like to talk about.
Hi, thank you, Dr. Furman, for a very fascinating and engaging lecture, all the visuals, and I think really brought to life the Texas culture there. For those of you out there, please continue to send in questions, and we'll collect them behind the scenes here. I want to begin. There's a number of questions asking about the breakdown between denominations in the community, is like Orthodox, Conservative, Reform, Chabad. Like, if you want to say more about some of those specific communities and whether they're growing or declining in Texas.
Okay. Thank you for that question. So I think that the best way to answer it, right? So all of the denominations are of course represented in the major cities. In San Antonio, where I grew up, there is, I think now, 2 Reform congregations, and one Conservative and one Orthodox. What may surprise you all, especially those of you who are unfamiliar with Texas, is that a lot of the growth that Houston and Dallas have experienced in the last 10 to 15 years or so has specifically been in the Orthodox community. There's been a large effort underway to recruit observant Jews to Texas, to help grow these communities, to help build the day schools here. And for a lot of folks who live in New York, New Jersey, California, Texas it's mild winters and no state income tax. And so just in the last few years, there's been a dramatic explosion of Orthodox Jews living in Texas, as Matthew, I'm sure, is aware. I think Houston alone has something on the order of, I think, 6 or 7 kosher restaurants. There is now a kollel here, as there is in Dallas. There is there's a modern Orthodox day school here, which has existed for decades, but there is now an ultra-Orthodox high school for boys and girls as well. So while all of the denominations are present here in Texas, what's been interesting to observe is the growth in the ultra-Orthodox community that's finding a home in the Lone Star State.
Thank you. And while we're on the subject of communities and neighborhoods, there's a question here about the neighborhood I actually lived in, and that you're also part of Meyerland. And I'm partially asking the question just to bring it up if you want to talk about it. The specific question was whether there's a Jewish connection to the name Meyerland, and or how just generally how did they get its name, and if you want to say more about that neighborhood, because.
Okay. Let's see. So yeah, I could say quite a bit about Meyerland. I'm working on a book, and I've spoken on a lot. So for those of you unfamiliar with Houston and Houston geography, so Meyerland is a suburban neighborhood in the southwest quadrant of the city. And it is the neighborhood to which Jews, when they began leaving the neighborhood Riverside Terrace that I spoke about earlier, they eventually migrated, not all of them, but many of them, to the Meyerland area in Southwest Houston. They did so for a number of reasons. Number one, it was sort of the new kind of up and coming suburban development at the time. Number one. And number two, unlike other areas of the city, it did not bar Jews from coming to settle there. There were other parts of the city, some of them, Houston's most exclusive neighborhoods, like River Oaks. For those of you who know River Oaks, it's kind of like the I don't know, the Beverly Hills or the Chevy Chase of Houston, for a kind of local analogy. But even other new suburban neighborhoods had a kind of secret covenant of not allowing Jews to purchase homes there. Meyerland welcomed Jews from the very beginning. And then there's the issue of the name. So Meyerland was founded by the Meyer family, M-E-Y-E-R, but they were not Jewish. They were Germans who came to this country around the time of the Civil War. And the Meyer patriarch, Joseph Meyer Sr., made his fortune in the hardware business, and then shrewdly bought up a ton of real estate, farmland, and ranch land on the outskirts of Houston, imagining that someday, optimistically, the city would grow and his land would become very valuable, which of course it did after his lifetime. And Meyerland is it's a really fascinating neighborhood to observe, to live in, and to think about for a number of reasons, but especially in a post-Hurricane Harvey world. Meyerland has continued to be the epicenter of Houston's Jewish community, even as, in the process of recovering from the floods of the last few years, Meyerland has had to be almost completely rebuilt. There's a lot of new construction. The Jewish Community Center now is in the midst of a major, something like a $50 million reconstruction project, and everything has to be built, 5-10 feet up in anticipation of the next flood. But Meyerland, continues to be the epicenter of the Houston Jewish community, and it's a fascinating neighborhood, as I said, to not only to live in, but to study.
Thank you. Yeah, it's amazing how the community continues to adapt and change, especially with all of the floods that happened over the years. I'm getting a lot of questions about both historical anti-Semitism and current anti-Semitism. If you want to address, some of the diversity of questions, I can throw out some of the pieces of them, but some of the questions are about jobs. I know that there was, the oil industry, and maybe, Jews who couldn't get jobs in the oil industry because of anti-Semitism. And you had also mentioned the openness, I guess, on the opposite end of the medical center as one example. And then a few weeks ago, we recently had the hostage situation there in Texas. So if any of those situations, or if you want to talk about whatever you feel comfortable with.
Okay. So anti-Semitism in Texas. and it, obviously, I mean, you can't have this discussion, in the shadow of Colleyville, of the events of just a few weeks ago, and not acknowledge it. But what's interesting to me as a scholar of Texas Jewish history is when I ask people, and I do a lot of interviewing of folks who grew up here, who have, whose family roots in Texas stretch back several generations. And what they almost always say to me is, oh, there was no anti-Semitism here growing up. I felt perfectly accepted. Most of my friends were Gentile friends, and they never said anything. They never called me Christ killer. They never told me I was going to hell if I if I didn't accept Jesus as my Lord and Savior, or what have you. And that tends to be the overwhelming response. But then sometimes if you kind of dig and press a little bit more, you hear stories. I once interviewed a woman who told me that there was no anti-Semitism really that she personally experienced in the small Texas town that she was raised in, except the Jews were not welcome at the country club. And I said, okay, right, Jews were not welcome at the country club. And then in the course of talking, she revealed to me that her high school history teacher had pressured her repeatedly to get a nose job. And I found that shocking. Right, that's not okay. But to her, that didn't instantly strike her as an example of anti-Semitism. I mean, certainly, I alluded to it tonight, but didn't discuss it in depth. But at various times and places in Texas history, the Klan was very strong. The threat of violence against Jews and Jewish communities in the era of Jim Crow was perceived to be very strong, and definitely factored into the decisions and choices of Jews, both individually and collectively in Texas, as to how they should respond to the civil rights movement, to some extent. But overall, I think that we imagine that anti-Semitism here historically has been much worse than I think maybe really it is. And I think that the number one reason for that is that Jews in all of America, but in Texas in particular, by virtue of being accepted as white, and I say that with an asterisk because not all Jews identify as white, right? And there's an increasing acknowledgement, right, that the Jewish community is so much more diverse than we've historically acknowledged. But for most of Texas Jewish history, Jews identified as white were perceived as white, and so therefore did not suffer in the way that other minorities did.
Great, thank you. I also have received a number of questions about the sort of political spectrum of Jews in Texas. If you want to briefly talk about that, or if you have more to expand upon, the statistics in the state.
Okay, right. So yeah, this is a good question, and I think it's another reason why Texas Jews are an interesting bunch to study and to get to know. So I think I forget what the latest Pew Report statistics on this were, because I didn't prepare for this question, although it's one I probably should have anticipated. Bottom line, Texas Jews as a whole are more conservative than Jews nationally. And I think that is especially true in the Orthodox community, which as a whole sort of leans more conservative than the rest of the American Jewish community. But I do think that Texas Jews are, and this is not to say that all Texas Jews are conservative, because it's certainly not true. I mean, remember that many folks who are Jewish who call Texas home today they didn't grow up here. Their family is not from here. They're transplants from California, from New York, from New Jersey, and so you have to factor that in mind. But I would say, and I think the statistics do bear it out, that there are more Jewish Republicans in Texas, that the numbers are higher than they are elsewhere. It'll be interesting to see moving forward, right, how those numbers grow or don't grow, as the demographics of Texas Jewry continue along the trends that they've been moving in for the last 10 or 20 years.
Great, thank you. I want to go back. There's a few questions. I want to go back to sort of the careers of the Jewish community in the area. There's what was the involvement of Jews in the sort of oil boom in Texas and in the oil industry, and in the same light, if you have more to say about the Jews' involvement within the medical center. I know the Houston Medical Center is the largest medical center in the world. So, like you said, many doctors came there, including my father-in-law. That's what brought my in-laws to Texas. But specifically, someone asked about the Anderson Cancer Center. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on either of those. That'd be greatly appreciated.
Okay, so there's a question about Texas Jews and livelihood. So that's a great question. So historically, Jews came to Texas as part of a much larger Anglo migration, and specifically in the middle decades of the 19th century, there was a huge influx of German, non-Jewish, German and Czech migrants. If you've been to Texas, if you've spent time in Texas, you grew up here, if you get in your car and you drive between Houston and San Antonio on I-10, you will pass Weimar, Texas. You will pass New Braunfels, and there's all these towns that have German and Czech names, and that's not an accident. They were founded by these German and Czech farmers who came here and really to a significant degree built up Texas. So Jews also came from Central Europe and made their way down to Texas in those years, but they didn't come to Texas to farm like the Germans and the Czech. They came to sell them stuff. So they opened general stores. They opened clothing stores, dry goods stores, jewelry stores. And in many of those, especially the small towns that we spoke about, such as Wharton and New Braunfels, you couldn't buy a suit in Wharton or New Braunfels on the high holy days, because all the clothing stores were owned by Jews and they all closed on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. For the most part, it's much later that Jews come to Texas to work in oil and gas, in the medical field, in aerospace, right? We didn't talk about NASA at all, but that has been a significant vehicle for Jewish migration to Texas. But in the earlier period, right, in the 19th century and the first decades of the 20th century, it's really about commerce and retail, right? The best examples being the Sackowitzes, right? The Marcus family, the Zales family, and others.
Great, thank you. I wanted to give you a chance. There's a few questions about the Galveston movement. I know you had mentioned that you could speak much more about it. Two broad questions. who was behind the Galveston movement? Was it an agency? Were there certain Jewish groups? And where did the Jews come from? Who was interested in coming? The 10,000 that you mentioned.
Okay. Great. So the person principally responsible for developing the Galveston Movement Project was a man named Jacob Schiff, who was a New York Jew of German descent. He was a financier and a philanthropist, but he was also an anti-Zionist. And he wanted, Schiff and his partners, for lack of a better word, they wanted very much to help get Jews out of Eastern Europe. I mean, it was already clear by 1905 that Eastern Europe was becoming increasingly inhospitable for Jews, both because of the just crushing poverty and terrible economic conditions, but also because of just relentless waves of anti-Semitic violence, right? These pogroms in which Jews were beaten, raped, murdered, so on and so forth. But Schiff did not believe that Palestine, that a national Jewish homeland was the answer. He wanted them to come to America, but he did not want them to go to New York. The Lower East Side was already sort of, teeming with Yiddish-speaking, immigrants, men with, beards, and women with, shaitels and rags on their heads. And there was a ton of poverty. There was a ton of unemployment in New York. And the idea was that if Jews continue to pour into Ellis Island and to stay in New York, that it was bad PR, for lack of a better phrase, right? That it made American Jews seem like bad, like poor candidates for Americanization. So the plan was to, as I said before, not let these immigrants get off the boat in New York, but instead to send them to Galveston, which was a railroad hub. And so from Galveston, they would be put on trains and matched according to their job skills with opportunities in places like Kansas City, Missouri, or Des Moines, Iowa, or St. Paul, Minnesota, or Fort Worth, Texas, as it were. And sometimes, they were sent to places that had small Jewish communities. Sometimes they were sent to places that had barely a Jewish community to speak of. But it's an important and not well-known chapter in the longer history of Jewish immigration to the United States. And even though 10,000 is really not that big a number, if you think about 2.5 million Eastern European Jews coming to the U.S. between 1880 and 1920, that's still 10,000 lives that were rescued from the Holocaust, and from the tragedy that unfolded years later. So it's a Texas Jewish story, but it's also an American Jewish story, and really, again, a story about America as a land of opportunity.
Yes, thank you. I have a few questions here on the subject. If you don't know much about, you can just let us know. But and I'll combine two pieces of it on conversos, or people rediscovering their Jewish heritage. If you know anything about that happening in Texas. I know last summer we had a program that mainly focused on the New Mexico community, but you had mentioned that there's a large Spanish-speaking Jewish population. So are there people within some of those communities maybe rediscovering Jewish heritage? And also, if you want to say more about where the people who are Spanish speaking within the community, where they came from, if some of them come from those origins or from other countries.
Okay, great. Yeah, that's a little bit outside my area of expertise. Certainly, the communities in Texas along the border, so in McAllen and Brownsville, and in Harlingen are where you see that most. in the community that I grew up in San Antonio, there were many Spanish-speaking Jews, but they tended to be, the descendants of Ashkenazi families that had come to Mexico or Argentina, in decades earlier in the 20th century. I mean, that is, I don't know if I still have family members watching this program, but some of you may know my relative David Epstein, who is a very active with the Haberman Institute. And David and I we're mishpacha, we're related. And our story is that, our family left Poland in the late 1920s, early 1930s, could not come to the United States and came instead to Mexico City, which is where my grandfather, who was David's uncle, those of you who know David, sorry for getting personal, but it's actually relevant to the question, where they settled. And then my grandparents met and married in Mexico City, but then moved to San Antonio in 1960 with their young children, my uncle and my father, to eventually start a business. So they're Spanish-speaking Jews, but they're Ashkenazi Spanish-speaking Jews, right? For whom English was, I think, probably my grandfather's, fifth or sixth language that he learned. So it doesn't quite fit the mold of the the crypto Jew or the Jew, the Jews kind of rediscovering their buried Sephardic roots. But that's just further reason why Jewish history is so fascinating and so wonderful. There's just so much to dig into.
Moving to a completely different subject, going back to what you talked about with food. There's a question here, just wondering if you mentioned that the chili cook-off and some kosher restaurants. Are there other traditions or things that families have adapted into their own, like Shabbat practice, or their kiddush or oneg in synagogues that are have the Texas mixing with the Jewish culture?
Okay. Probably the rodeo or the chili cook-off is the best example of that. And normally the kosher chili cook-off is kind of timed to coincide with rodeo. I think that that's really a question in a lot of ways that draws on individual family traditions. On the one hand, you have families that who have been in Texas for generations, and and have sort of been here a while, and for whom barbecue and chili it's not uncommon or strange to find them on a Shabbat table. But then you have the increasing phenomenon of folks who have moved to Texas in the last 5-10 years or so, and are undergoing that same process of kind of learning how to be Jewish in Texas. And maybe they didn't grow up eating some of these foods, but they'll start doing it. Again, in my own family, we had guacamole at Passover, and my grandmother, may she rest in peace, would make matzo balls with jalapeno in them. And I just sort of grew up, thinking that everybody did that. It wasn't weird or strange to me because it's what I grew up with, but that's just anecdotal evidence. One last point about Texas Jewish food. It's kind of, I don't know if it's funny or sad. It's probably a little bit of both. But arguably the foremost delicatessen in the United States today is not in New York. It's in Houston, Texas. It's at Kenny and Ziggy's. Ziggy Gruber he's been in Houston now, I think 25 years or so, maybe not quite 25. And he is a deli legend. And Kenny and Ziggy's delicatessen has been featured on the Food Network. There was a documentary made about Ziggy. So it's not just that, Texas and Houston are this kind of cute outpost of a sort of, Texas Jewish synthesis. But at least, in the world of delicatessen, if you want a good pastrami sandwich, you got to come down to Houston to get it, which is a really funny and interesting development.
Yeah, I've eaten at Kenny and Ziggy's many times myself, and another example that I like is the bagel shop there in Meyerland is half kosher and half not kosher. You can get kosher bagels on one side and I don't know, probably ham and or whatever, or at least non-kosher food on the other side. So it's a funny mix and how the community balances the two. On the note about the sort of like the Texas culture, you mentioned the rodeo and sort of the Jew. There's a pride that Texas has, unlike anywhere I've lived before. And I'm wondering, there's a couple of questions about you mentioned Zionism is central to Jewish identity in Texan identity. I wonder what your thoughts are on that. Maybe is there a correlation between this sense of Texas pride and Zionism?
Mm-hmm. I think that there is. It's hard to define and explain it. But as I mentioned before, it's something that I, having grown up in Texas and then left and lived, for about 15 years or so, right outside the state, and then come back to it as an adult, with a family. One of the things that that I've perceived is the way that support for Israel really here across the denominational spectrum is really a staple of Jewish identity. And why is that? Is it because Texas Jews are more conservative? I don't think that's a sufficient explanation. I really don't. I do think that there's something about the two Lone Star states and a certain just kind of, I don't know, an ethos or a feeling of that Texas and Israel have these certain things in common, a certain kind of pioneering spirit, almost, as it were. It doesn't hurt also that as evangelical Christian support for Israel becomes more and more prominent, that becomes a kind of arena for Jewish Christian interfaith dialogue, right, over the issue of support for Israel, which is a really fascinating topic, and really that whole world of evangelical support for Israel has its roots in Texas to a large extent, and in San Antonio, where I'm from, Reverend John Hagee of Cornerstone Church enjoyed this decades-long friendship with Rabbi Aryeh Sheinberg of San Antonio's Road Face Shalom congregation, who just passed away in the last few months. May his memory be a blessing. But that's another way in which Texas Jews kind of punch above their weight a little bit and have an outside influence on larger trends in the American Jewish world.
Great, thank you. And we're coming to conclusion now, and we're obviously not going to be able to get through all the questions, but there's a few just people who are interested in maybe being able to research their own history who came through Galveston, both in the 1800s, through even later periods. And I know you're working on bringing this archive together. If there's resources for people to be able to research their family history and how that's coming along.
Okay. So if you have or you suspect that you have family history that goes through Galveston, the Rosenberg Library in Galveston would be the place to start, and the Galveston Historical Foundation. And you can just do a simple Google search for the Rosenberg Library or for the Galveston Historical Foundation, and you should find access to digitized ship manifests that you can search through, which is really wonderful. And it's fantastic to be alive in an age when we're able to be connected digitally and have access to census records and ship manifest records at the means of just a few clicks of a computer button is really something else. I'm also very happy to put up again on the screen my contact information. I think I neglected to do that earlier, but if you'd like to be in touch with me for any reason following this program, my email, my phone number are here up on the screen for just a minute, and I'd be happy to be in touch with you. I also want to encourage you to look up the Houston Jewish History Archive. We're on Facebook, we're on Instagram. Our Instagram handle is Rice Jewish Studies, and be happy to be in touch with any of you. Thank you so much for the opportunity to spend an hour and a half talking about Texas Jewish history. I had a lot of fun.
Yeah, thank you. It was a great presentation, and we really appreciate it. And we'll be sure to send out all your contact information and maybe the video. There were a few quests to see if people could find the video you mentioned, so we can send out links and information in our follow-up emails. So thanks again, and it was great to talk about Houston with you and see you. So I appreciate you taking the time, and I hope all of you out there, thank you for joining us. Thanks. Have a great night.
Thanks so much, everybody.